Hi, this is Kevin Trainer. Welcome to my briefing for Chapter 6 of the Pinkham book, Django Unleashed. And the way we're doing the units in my course, we didn't cover one part of Chapter 5 when we were on Chapter 5, and that's how to redirect the root URL. So the URL that we want to catch is the one where we get the domain name and nothing further. Okay, we just go to the site. And right now in our tutorial, our Easy University tutorial, which you'll get to after this, we just get a 404 when we do that. And that's not the end of the world, but there's some code that's covered in Chapter 5, which allows us to catch that URL pattern and redirect it. So I just want to point out here that in Chapter 5, if we go down to example 5.76, we'll see the URL pattern that we're going to use. We're going to catch the empty string coming after the domain name, and we're going to have a view called redirect root, and then here's our redirect root view. It's just a pretty simple function-based Django view. And here what they decide to do is to redirect it as though it's it's going to go to the blog. And they have a couple of versions of it, but what we essentially do is we pick where we think it's going to go and we redirect it to another view. Okay, so I just want to point out that's the code. It's from Chapter 5. We're not going to be doing it in our tutorial until Chapter 6, and that's that. So Chapter 6 proper. Chapter 6 is the chapter where we hook up all the pages that we have so far. Now, the pages we have so far in the applications are the index pages, which Pinkham calls list pages, and a lot of people do. Okay, so that we have the when we go to the list pages, we get a list of all the instances of that model class. Okay, and then we've got the detail pages, which will show the values associated with one instance of a model class. And we have this kind of expectation long term that we're going to populate the href attributes in the templates such that we can go from page to page. So we'll go to a list page, and then we'll pick the instance that we want, and we'll click on that instance, and it'll be a link that'll take us to the detail page. And then on the detail page, there'll be further links, and we'll be able to navigate around. But we really have to know how to do that, and that's what the chapter is all about. Okay? Pretty early on, he talks about this concept of reversing URL patterns. And that's a really strong part of the Django framework. Okay, we've taken the controller part of the classic model view controller, and we've broken it up to two parts: urls.py and views.py. And one can kind of say, well, why did you have to do that? Why couldn't you just left those two together and used conventional naming. And one of the arguments for the design as they took it was that URLs does more than simply the routing. Okay, and now we're going to see what more it can do, and the claim here is that we can use it in reverse. Okay, and we can have it generate the URL character string that we're going to want to use on all these pages, and that's it just happens to be one of the properties of the URL pattern classes that are in urls.py. So when we saw them the first time, we thought they were only for routing, but now we find out they're also for generating URLs that we're going to use on our pages. And then you start to see the argument why separating them out into their own part has a real power. Okay, because it allows for this reuse of them. Okay, whereas if we had bundled up the routing with the more classic action part that we put into views.py, I don't think we'd have had that opportunity. Okay, so with that in mind, we're going to figure out how we're going to do this. And he goes through a couple of versions. He goes through the version where you call the reverse method, and you pass it the name of your URL pattern. And you'll remember here that when he names the URL pattern, he doesn't put the name URL pattern on the end. He doesn't put that those extra characters. But I want to distinguish the name of the URL pattern from the name of the view, and I want to distinguish that from the name of the template as well. So I tend to add that onto the end. So he goes through a couple of these things, but here's what he eventually comes down to. We're going to use a template tag, and the template tag is going to be the one that has the curly and the %, and it's going to have essentially two arguments inside of it, or parameters separated by a space. And the first one is just URL that says, that tells the infrastructure, okay, we want to generate a URL string. And then the next thing that we pass to it is the name of the URL pattern. Okay, and that's all that we're doing. And then it does it in reverse. Okay, well, for some of our URL patterns, that's really easy for it to do because there are no kind of variable parts to the URL pattern. So when we have a URL pattern that says something like, if I have the string instructor that I want to run the view instructor list, well, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so it's not all that hard to think about how you would do that in reverse. You would say, well, I have the view instructor list, or I have the pattern of that has instructor in it, and we go, oh yeah, well, no, let's put that together with the we know the character string has to go into the URL to get that done. Let's just put that together. It's a little bit harder when we're going to a detail page because, of course, when the URL is inbound, for instance, we would have instructor and then a slash, and then we would have the primary key. Here they're doing stuff like the slug for the blog post. But so we would have a key coming in, and then it takes a little bit of thought. Well, how could you reverse that? Well, you'd have to give it a key value on the reverse side. So when we call a reverse on a more complicated URL pattern, one that takes a variable or one that picks out a a variable from the string, well, we have to give it a variable with a value in order to reconstitute it. And that's what we're doing with this quargs or keyword arguments. Okay, so what we're doing is saying, okay, we want to come up with the reverse of this. We know what URL pattern we're going to be using. Okay, we know that, and then we also have to know that within the URL pattern, it's extracting a slug. And what we're going to do is to say, well, the value of the slug should come out to Django. And actually, it's actually bright enough to take the URL pattern and take this variable value and work it backwards, which is not easy code, right? It's pretty tricky code, but it'll run it backwards, and let's say, oh, well, a URL string that would trigger this pattern and result in this kind of the equivalent key that you just gave me would be this character string. So again, could you and I write that code? Yeah, we could, but we wouldn't write it in an afternoon. It's pretty magical stuff. It's not total magic, but it's pretty cool stuff. So how do these things look when you put them into the template? So let's go down and find some template. Okay, well, we're not using it in the template yet because I want to show you another way to do this. Okay, so this version here, we're at example 6.8. This is the way to do it by saying that you want it to generate a URL, you want to identify the pattern, and then of course you want to pass the value that you want to use. Okay, well, gee, that's great. Now, is there another version that we want to do? Yeah, the version that we're going to do, in fact, in our Easy University tutorial. And it has to do with this idea of there being a canonical or or one appropriate, one way to get the URL for one of the resources we have in the system. So when the resources are database tables and the rows in the table, okay, the resource is the row, okay, and so then the question is, what's the URL that's associated with that? And the idea is that we could go back to the model classes and we could add a method. So we could say for any instance of that model type, in the Pinkham example, that would be a tag instance or a post instance. In Easy University, that would be a semester instance or a student instance. Okay, well, we can go back to that and say, I want you to give me the absolute URL. Now, whether that's a great name for the function or for the method, get absolute URL, or not. Here you can see the example in 6.9. We're actually calling get absolute URL for a tag. Okay, That's how you get the URL string for a particular instance of the tag model class. Okay. Well, it would be the same thing for a semester, the same thing for a student. Okay. So what we're saying here is that for some of the things that we have, we're going to even simplify it further so that the code that's going to generate the tag, the code that we've seen before, we're not going to put that into our template. What we're going to put into our template is a call to this get absolute URL, and we're going to put that code that generates the right URL string, we're going to put that into the model class. Okay, so how does that look like? Well, let's show that. So, gonna have to find our way to this URL, a tag detail. If I don't find it soon, I'm going to put you guys on hold. Here we are. So here on example 6.34, okay, here's what we've done, okay. He's doing this for the tag model class, okay. And what he says is that if you have an instance of tag, well then you can call get absolute URL on it. And what's it going to do? Well, it's going to generate the URL string. And how's it going to do it? Well, no magic. We already see the code. It's going to call reverse and pass it the appropriate URL pattern name, and it's going to pass it the data of any kind of key value or key values that you're going to need in order to run the code backwards. In the case of a tag, you need a slug. Okay. In the case of an instructor, you would need an instructor ID. In the case of a section, you'd need a section ID. Okay. And so now the details about what's the go-to page for a tag. Well, where do you get that? Well, you get the URL for it by calling get absolute URL on the tag instance. So what's going to happen is that get absolute URL is going to be what we put into our template. And this code that actually generates the URL is going to be in a nice little slot in each of the model classes. So we're going to go through our model classes and we're going to give each of them a get absolute URL with the appropriate code to generate a URL for an instance of that kind of model class, which of course is a row in that kind of table. Okay, and so now when we get down to the template itself, what's going on is tag is a call to get absolute URL. And what kind of a tag is that inside of? Well, it's inside of a template tag. In this case, it's inside of a double curly. Okay, you'll recall that if we did it directly, we used a curly with a % inside of it. Here we're using one of the double curlies. That's the other kind of template tag. And we're just saying tag, which is one of the names that's known inside of our template, dot get absolute URL. Now, I just want to point out that there are no parens. It's sometimes hard in this Django framework to know whether you're just going to give it the name of the method or whether you're going to put the parentheses on the end so that it looks like a method call itself. And this is one where you do the former. You don't put the parentheses on the end. We're just giving it the name of the method, and then it's going to build the call. Okay. So if you see the rest of the code that we have, we just do it for the rest of the stuff. So we go down to tag detail, and we do one for tag detail. Oh, I'm sorry, that was the one for tag detail. Here we're going to do it for startup. So we go to the startup class and we do get absolute URL, and then we go to the startup list, and we can use up there, we can use get absolute URL. Okay, and then we go even further. Here's the one for blog post. So we go to the post class, and we create a get absolute URL. And again, in the case of the post and the reverse that we're doing inside of there, well, of course, what do you need? Well, you need to know the name of the URL pattern, but you also have to provide in this QARGs, or keyword arguments, you have to provide enough variables to fill in the slots in the URL pattern. Okay, and the slots each have a name. There's a slot year, there's a slot month, there's a slot slug. Okay. It's a little bit easier in the tutorial that we're doing, Easy University. Each of the tables has a very simple key. It has a typical ID key, and so we're not going to have to do this in our tutorial code. But it's kind of nice to see what happens when you have a URL that's passing in more than one value. All right. So the variable values here are the year, the month, and the slug. And so when we want to work in reverse, we have to say, okay, what would the string be for this year, this month, this slug? Okay. So we saw earlier that we could use this on the list pages, and here is how we would use it on the detail page. Okay, and again, as long as we're doing the call to get absolute URL, it's just going to be the name that the object is known by in the template .get absolute URL, and we put that in the double curlies, and that just goes inside the quotes for the href attribute in the link. So it's really pretty simple stuff. Okay. Putting it all together. Well, it's just a matter of doing this in a methodical way. Okay, so now that we know how to do this for our pages, then what we need to do is we need to go into all the pages, all the templates that we created so far. So we have 5 lists, and we've got 5 detail pages, and we need to put the code in that goes to get absolute URL, right? And then we need to go to each of the model classes and actually construct an appropriate get absolute URL that it generates the right string using a call to reverse. Okay, and we just do that for all the pages that we have. You have to remember that the detail pages have links to other detail pages. So for instance, if you go to the one that has the most links in our tutorial is the one for the section detail page, because the section detail page has a link for the semester, has a link for the course, it has a link for the instructors for this section. It has a list of links for the instructors and has a list of links for the students. And of course, we need to resolve all of those. But it's pretty straightforward, and when we're done, we wind up with a set of pages that are really pretty tightly linked with each other. And the style of using these kind of pages, which I demo on the tutorial video, it's pretty distinctive, and it's a pretty rich experience for the users. And I think you'll like it. So that's it for the chapter. Again, he does really talk about a couple of ways to do things here, but it's the version that we have in the bottom that we eventually implement. And it's just a question of applying it to all the pages that we have, all the list pages and all the detail pages, and then we're done. So I'm going to say bye so you can go on and do your reading and do your tutorialing and start having some fun. Bye for now.